What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
At my brother's engagement party, while the waitstaff floated around with trays of smoked salmon crostinis and flutes of overpriced champagne, my father stood at the head of the table, his hand curled around a heavy glass, smirking like a man who believed the moment belonged to him and no one else. The lights were warm, the air humming with laughter, and the room had that artificial glow of money well spent on appearances. Everyone leaned in, expecting something charming, witty, maybe a bit sentimental from the man who always loved being the center of any goddamn room. I already knew it was coming. I'd seen it in his eyes the second I walked through the door, that familiar glint of condescension masked as warmth, that "let me remind you of your place" look he always reserved just for me. He cleared his throat, one of those fake little coughs meant to silence the room. To Zach, he began, beaming with paternal pride that had always eluded me. To the child who actually understands commitment. And then he chuckled, lightly, like it was just an innocent remark. But the chuckle spread like wildfire. People followed his lead, laughing along, polite and nervous, some more than others. A few glanced at me, unsure of whether they should laugh or not, their eyes darting like mice trapped in a kitchen full of broken secrets. My mother stared at her plate, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line, the way she always did when she pretended not to hear something unbearable. And Brittany, Zach's fiancée, blushed and smiled like it was some awkward but flattering joke. She didn't know any better. Everyone laughed. Except me. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just stood up, slowly, deliberately, and took the manila folder I had brought in my purse. My heels clicked once, twice, as I walked over to the table, past the flower arrangements and the champagne flutes and the smiling liars pretending they didn't know what was about to happen. I didn't say a word. I laid the folder right next to his plate, opened it, and slid out a single sheet of paper, the kind that starts with "Certificate of Marriage" in a bold serif font, the kind that makes people shut the hell up. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the string quartet stumbling off tempo in the far corner before they caught the shift in atmosphere and stopped completely. Zach's smile faltered, confused. My father froze. I watched the blood drain from his face so quickly it was almost clinical, like watching a man flatline in slow motion. He didn't even look at the paper at first. He just stared at me, like he thought he could scare me back into submission with silence. But I didn't move. I let the document sit there like it was a loaded gun in the middle of the table. "I figured if we're toasting commitment," I said, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the tension like a blade, "it's worth mentioning that Dad signed this. With someone else. 2 weeks ago. In Vegas." You could practically hear the gasp before it happened. Brittany's hand flew to her mouth, my mother's chair screeched back half an inch, and someone actually dropped a glass, the shatter echoing like punctuation on the sentence I had just dropped on all of them. "She's not Mom," I added, because I wanted them to feel the edge of it. I wanted the words to slice through the illusion they'd all been so desperate to maintain. And she wasn't alone. Zach stood up so fast his chair tipped over behind him. "Megan, what the hell are you doing?" he barked, half in shock, half in anger, as if I had just ruined something beautiful, as if I was the one who had brought shame into the room rather than exposing the truth that had been rotting under our feet for years. But I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on our father, the man who'd spent years treating me like the family failure for divorcing a man who hit walls when he couldn't hit me, the man who told everyone I didn't understand what marriage meant because I left instead of staying and working it out like an adult. I watched his jaw twitch, the silence dragging longer than it ever had in any of our family dinners, and for once, he had no clever comeback, no cutting remark, no charming lie to smooth over what I'd just done. Brittany rose slowly from her seat, her face pale, and looked at Zach, then at me, then at the marriage certificate. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded once. Then she turned and walked out. No dramatics. No screaming. Just quiet, fast steps and the sound of the door opening and closing behind her. Zach didn't follow. No one did. It was like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say it wasn't true, for someone to laugh, and say it was some tasteless prank, but no one did, because deep down they knew. Maybe they hadn't known about the second marriage, but they'd known something was wrong with him for years. He was too smooth, too cold, too performative. And now they were watching the mask slide off in real time. "You always knew how to make a scene," my father finally said, and it was weak, like a dying man's whisper, desperate to regain some kind of control. "And you always knew how to lie," I replied, not blinking. There was no applause. No outburst. Just stunned silence as I walked out of the room, leaving behind the sound of shattering illusions and the heavy weight of a truth no one had wanted to confront. But before I left the building, I heard my mother's voice behind me, quiet but clear. "How long?" she asked him. And that's when I knew. The show wasn't over. It had just started. There's a certain kind of silence that only happens in families like mine, a silence that doesn't stem from peace or understanding, but from the quiet agreements people make to never talk about the things that matter, the things that hurt, the things that pull the curtain back on the smiling portraits over the fireplace and show you what really lives behind them. That silence was practically woven into our DNA, like some ugly inheritance passed down through generations, where dignity meant pretending everything was fine and loyalty meant keeping your mouth shut even when your stomach turned. That's the silence I grew up in, and by the time I was old enough to understand that love in our household came with conditions and expiration dates, I had already been trained to smile through it like a goddamn soldier on parade. My father, Peter, was the kind of man who could charm a room before he even opened his mouth, the kind of man who seemed to suck all the air out of a space just by walking into it, not because he was larger than life, but because he needed everything and everyone to orbit around him like planets in a system he designed himself. He was successful, of course he was. Senior partner at a law firm that handled corporate litigation, country club member for over 20 years, the kind of man who had opinions about wine and cufflinks and thought they made him more credible. But behind closed doors, he was cold in a way that made your skin itch, like being stared at too long through a two-way mirror. He didn't yell, not usually, and he didn't raise his hands, he didn't have to. His words were sharp enough to cut through bone without ever breaking a sweat. When I was growing up, I was always the one who talked back, the one who didn't take his smug little insults lying down, and that didn't make me brave in his eyes, it made me insubordinate. My younger brother Zach, on the other hand, knew the script by heart. He smiled when he was told, he agreed when he was expected to, and he knew how to ask for things in a tone that made our father feel respected, even worshipped. Of course Zach was the favorite. Of course he got the car on his 16th birthday, the college tuition paid in full, the down payment on his first house. I got lectures and guilt and long, uncomfortable silences at dinner when I dared to choose my own path, and later, when I got divorced, I got public humiliation in the form of a toast at a family barbecue where my father praised Zach for not giving up at the first sign of discomfort, like some people. That had been the summer after I left my husband, Dave, a man who could go from laughing with my son to throwing a whiskey tumbler against the wall in the same hour. But when I tried to explain that to my parents, my father looked at me and said, "Marriage isn't supposed to be easy, Megan. Maybe if you didn't run every time someone disappointed you, you'd understand that." That sentence, that particular twist of the knife, was the one that stayed with me longer than any of Dave's shouting or slammed doors. My father didn't care what had happened to me, not really. What mattered to him was that I had embarrassed the family, that I had broken something that was supposed to remain unbroken, no matter how painful, no matter how cruel. Commitment to him was about preservation, not love, not respect, not safety, just the image of wholeness, polished and polished until the cracks looked like design. I swallowed that truth for years. I didn't fight back, not because I agreed, but because I was tired. Raising my son alone was hard enough without trying to maintain ties with a family that treated me like an inconvenient footnote. I went to the events, birthdays, holidays, fundraisers, and I smiled. I made the small talk. I brought the desserts. I laughed at the stories I'd heard 100 times, and I let my father ignore me like it was a favor. But then, about a year ago, I stopped by his office unexpectedly, something I never did, and that's when I noticed it. Just a flicker, really. A quick closing of a folder, a strange tension in his voice when he said, "You can't be here right now." The woman who walked out a few minutes later, tall, blonde, maybe 10 years younger than him, looked surprised to see me. She gave me a polite smile, the kind women give when they're not sure if they've just walked in on something private or something forbidden. And my father? He didn't even introduce her. I didn't say anything then, not even when I got home. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it wasn't what it looked like, that maybe she was a client or a colleague or someone he was mentoring, like he always claimed when women hovered around his orbit. But the next time I visited, she was there again. And the next time too. Her name was Linda. I overheard it in a conversation he had on the phone when he thought I wasn't listening. He called her darling. He didn't call anyone darling, not even my mother. That's when the silence started to feel dangerous. I started watching him, collecting the inconsistencies, the appointments that didn't match his calendar, the lies he told my mother about late meetings and conferences that didn't exist. And I started to remember every time he accused me of being impulsive, irresponsible, unfaithful to the values he pretended to cherish. The hypocrisy of it wasn't just insulting, it was infuriating. He had built an entire identity around the idea that he was the stable one, the honorable one, the patriarch who held the family together with old-school discipline and moral superiority. And now he was sneaking around like a college kid with a fake ID and a credit card that didn't belong to him. But the thing that finally pushed me over the edge, the thing that made me start digging, really digging, was a conversation I overheard at Thanksgiving. He was talking to one of his colleagues on the phone in the study, and I heard him say, "I'll be free after the second week of June." Vegas is quiet then, fewer eyes. At the time, it didn't register. But a few months later, I found the receipt from the Bellagio in his car's glove compartment. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't a phase. This was a man planning a future. A future without my mother. So I made a decision. If he wanted to play house with someone else, he could. But he wasn't going to do it in secret, and he sure as hell wasn't going to humiliate me for my choices while he quietly built a double life behind the backs of everyone who trusted him. I was done playing the role of the disgraced daughter. I was done being quiet. If commitment mattered so damn much to him, I was going to show the entire family what his version of commitment really looked like. I just had to wait for the perfect moment. And that moment, as it turned out, was sitting right there in a velvet chair at my brother's engagement party. There's a particular kind of clarity that doesn't arrive gently or with grace, doesn't sneak up in a dream or fall into place like puzzle pieces you've patiently waited to assemble, but rather slams itself into your life like a speeding car through a red light, loud, undeniable, and violently illuminating. That's exactly what it felt like the moment I stopped giving my father the benefit of the doubt and started looking at him not as the flawed patriarch who had simply made a few selfish choices over the years, but as a man fully capable of constructing an entire false reality to maintain his image, all while shredding the lives of those closest to him without even blinking. That shift in perspective was both horrifying and liberating, because once you start seeing someone's lies clearly, there's no going back. Not to comfort, not to ignorance, not even to civility. I started with the easiest place, his car. It's almost laughable, in hindsight, how carelessly men like my father treat their secrets once they've convinced themselves that no one would dare question them. The glove compartment was practically begging to be opened, and what I found inside was the first tangible crack in the mask he wore so proudly. A Bellagio parking receipt dated exactly 2 weeks prior, printed with his license plate number and a timestamp that proved he'd stayed overnight on a Tuesday. A Tuesday he had told my mother, filled with back-to-back meetings at the firm and a dinner with a client from San Diego. That night, she had packed him an extra tie and wished him good luck. I remember her telling me over the phone that he'd sounded tired, but dedicated, and that she was proud of how hard he still worked. Meanwhile, the truth sat curled in a forgotten slip of paper among dry cleaning coupons and mints. I didn't say anything then. Not yet. I photocopied it at the UPS store down the street, scanned it to my email, and stored the physical copy in a folder I labeled, with bitter sarcasm, Dad's business trips. I hadn't known what else I'd find or where this would lead, but instinct told me this was only the beginning, and something in me, maybe the old wound that never fully healed from all his years of judgment, made me hungrier than I wanted to admit for the full story. The next step was the firm's website, where I knew from past snooping that they liked to post pictures of their events, fundraisers, legal conferences, executive retreats. What caught my eye wasn't my father's presence or absence, but his tie. The same paisley tie he wore in one of the Vegas hotel photos I would later find on someone else's Facebook page. I'll never forget the moment I saw it. Him, with his arm around a woman in a coral dress, the city skyline lit up behind them, and a caption that read, "Nothing like celebrating love in Vegas." What a weekend. The account belonged to a woman named Shelley, tagged at a rooftop bar just off the strip. Her profile was public. She wasn't discreet. Among the photos, one caught my attention more than the rest, a close-up of a hand holding a marriage certificate, gold seal pressed against the corner, with two names clearly visible, Peter Whitmore and Linda Harrison. I sat there in the dark of my apartment, with the glow of the screen illuminating my living room, my fingers frozen on the trackpad, and I stared at that certificate like it had spoken my name out loud. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. I enlarged the image, screenshot it, then went straight to the Clark County Clerk's online database. And there it was, registered, public, completely legal. My father had married someone else on a Friday morning, 3 days before his 39th anniversary with my mother. The bile rose in my throat faster than the anger. I wanted to call someone, anyone, to scream or cry or laugh at the absurdity, but I didn't. I just sat there, teeth clenched, a storm collecting in my chest. Because in that moment, what crushed me wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the cruel simplicity of it. He hadn't just cheated, he had planned it, filed it, documented it, and then come home to my mother as if nothing had changed. He still kissed her cheek, still took her to church, still sat at the head of the table on Sundays acting like he was the goddamn backbone of our family. And suddenly, I understood everything, the coldness, the backhanded remarks, the subtle distancing from me ever since my divorce. I wasn't just the daughter who gave up on marriage. I had become the mirror he couldn't look into. My choice to leave a man who didn't love me the right way had threatened the foundation he'd built his whole identity on. That loyalty meant silence, that sacrifice meant suffering, and that respect could be faked with a firm handshake and a crisp suit. I had broken the rules of the performance, and for that, I had become disposable. I began collecting. The credit card statements, the travel records, the photos, the emails. I didn't just want a smoking gun. I wanted the entire armory. I called in a favor from an old friend who worked in digital forensics, and he helped me trace some of my father's transactions that didn't align with his calendar. Jewelry stores, luxury car rentals, flower deliveries, none of which had ever been for my mother. And yet, she still believed he was just tired from work. That woman, Linda, had an Instagram profile full of inspirational quotes about starting over and finding real love later in life. She'd posted a picture of herself in a white dress with the caption, "Finally found my forever." It had been liked by mutual friends I didn't even know they shared, people who had clearly been at the wedding, people who had known and said nothing. My father had built a second life so polished and distant from the one we shared that I almost couldn't believe he was capable of carrying both without breaking. But that's the thing about men like my father. They don't break. They bend others until they fit. And that's when I made the decision, no more hiding, no more collecting. I wasn't going to drop hints or send anonymous letters. I wasn't going to leave it up to fate or karma or guilt to catch up with him. I was going to bring it all into the light, not privately, not behind closed doors where apologies could be whispered and lies could be repackaged. I was going to do it publicly, boldly, and with all the dignity he'd spent years denying me. The engagement party was already on the calendar. The stage had been set. And this time, the performance would be mine. There comes a point, somewhere between anger and resignation, where revenge stops being a heat and starts becoming a plan, something slow, precise, deliberate, like the measured click of a combination lock turning toward the moment it opens. I had spent enough time feeling betrayed, humiliated, and dismissed by the man who raised me to understand that emotion alone would never win this war. He thrived in a world where emotion was weakness and power came from control. And if I wanted to wound him in a place he actually felt, I would need to think like him, cold, clean, strategic. I couldn't just expose what he had done. I needed to do it in a way that forced him to sit in the wreckage, surrounded by the very people he manipulated, adored, or used as props in his carefully curated life. And what better place to shatter the illusion than the engagement party he had practically orchestrated from top to bottom, where every detail, from the catering to the guest list, was a reflection of the image he'd spent decades perfecting? The key was timing. I didn't want to scream in the middle of the appetizers or interrupt the band during their first set. I needed the evening to settle, for the laughter to grow warm and unguarded, for the drinks to loosen tongues and lower defenses. That way, when the truth finally landed, it wouldn't just sting, it would rupture. I watched my father closely in the weeks leading up to the event, not because I doubted he'd go through with the charade, but because I wanted to know exactly how comfortable he had become in his performance. And let me tell you, he was thriving. He made little speeches at family dinners, sent out printed invitations with gold-embossed lettering, hired a photographer to document the night, and even practiced the toast with Zach behind closed doors. He stood in our mother's kitchen, pouring wine for guests, smiling like a man who believed nothing could ever catch up to him. I chose the moment carefully, the toast. It was predictable, it was public, and more than anything, it was his. He would stand at the center of the celebration, raise a glass, and bask in the admiration of a room that didn't yet know the kind of man they were applauding. And that's exactly when I would take it away from him. But before that, I needed to make sure the truth I carried wasn't just a confrontation. It had to be undeniable, documented, and completely irrefutable. I printed 3 copies of the marriage certificate, not just for theatrics, but because I didn't trust what would happen when the storm broke. One I would place in his hand. The second I would leave with Zach. And the third I would keep on me, just in case the others disappeared. I also did something I hadn't initially planned. I invited Linda. Not directly, of course. I didn't want her to know it was from me. I created a fake email address, wrote an invitation that sounded like it had come from one of the junior partners at my father's firm, someone vaguely familiar but not close enough to raise suspicion, and sent it along with a line about Peter being so excited to introduce you to the rest of the family. I didn't know if she would come. In fact, I expected she might decline. But deep down, I suspected she'd been waiting for an opportunity like this, to step fully into the life she believed was being built for her, and I was betting that the idea of a public debut, especially one tied to a family milestone, would be too tempting to resist. The night before the party, I sat in my apartment surrounded by documents, photos, printouts of emails, and phone screenshots, not because I needed more evidence, but because I needed to see the full scope of what I was about to detonate. I wasn't second-guessing myself, not exactly, but I wanted to be sure that what I was doing wasn't just born of vengeance or pride. I wanted to believe that exposing the truth had value, that it might free my mother, that it might wake Zach up from the fantasy of our perfect family, that maybe it could even force my father to see the consequences of the world he'd crafted. But if I'm being honest, I also knew part of me just wanted to win for once. That morning, I got dressed like I was going to war. Not in anything flashy or dramatic, that would have been too obvious. I wore a simple navy dress, clean lines, no jewelry except my wedding ring, which I hadn't worn in 5 years, but slid on again like a final, ironic nod to the commitment my father claimed I didn't understand. I rehearsed the moment in my head a dozen times, not the words exactly, but the rhythm of it, the posture, the delivery. I wanted to speak just loud enough to be heard without shouting, to be calm when everyone else wasn't, to be undeniable without becoming hysterical. I wasn't going to ask questions. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. I was going to state the facts and let the silence do the rest. The room was just as I expected, crystal glasses, a string quartet tucked in the corner, smiles stretched thin across faces that had been holding their breath for years without realizing it. I played the part of the quiet daughter for the first hour, drinking slowly, making small talk, waiting for the cue. When my father stood, raising his glass with that practiced smirk he always wore when he thought he was about to land a perfectly timed performance. I knew it was time. He started his toast with something light, of course, Zach's childhood stories, a joke about Brittany's obsession with dogs, a nod to their bright future. And then came the line I had been waiting for, the one I knew was coming, because it was the same one he'd rehearsed for decades, to the child who actually understands commitment. That was when I stood. That was when I walked, deliberately, heels tapping in the pause between his sentence and the first nervous chuckles. That was when I laid the manila folder on the table in front of him and opened it without a word, letting the sheet slide forward like a blade being drawn. The gold seal shimmered under the chandelier, and the silence that followed was thicker than anything I'd ever heard. Every face turned, not toward the paper, but toward me, because in that moment, I wasn't the disappointment anymore. I was the reckoning. And then, as if summoned by the truth itself, Linda walked in. Not flashy, not dramatic, just perfectly timed. She froze when she saw the room, the paper, my father's face. And the look that passed between them was enough to confirm everything I hadn't said aloud. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just revenge. It was justice. There is a certain kind of quiet that follows catastrophe, not the peaceful kind that comes when a storm finally passes, but the heavy, suffocating silence that descends when everyone in the room suddenly realizes that the world they've been living in wasn't built on truth, or love, or anything remotely solid, but on pretense and performance and the mutual agreement to believe in a story because it's easier than confronting the real one. That was the silence that fell over the engagement party after the certificate landed, after my father's face went slack and pale, after Linda's heels froze on the polished floor just inside the entrance, where she clearly hadn't expected a room full of strangers to be staring at her as if she were a ghost, or worse, a truth no one had invited in. I stood there, calm on the surface, but trembling in that deep place no one sees, the part of you that knows that once something breaks this badly, there's no such thing as putting it back together, not in the same shape, not with the same people, and certainly not with the same illusions. I wish I could say that what followed was satisfying, some neat and cinematic unraveling of lies, with gasps and accusations, and someone slapping someone else across the face. But the truth is that when people are confronted with something they've spent years pretending isn't real, they don't explode, they implode. My mother didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even look at me. She walked, slowly and almost mechanically, to the document on the table, leaned in to read the names and the date, and then she turned to my father and asked, in a voice so soft it felt cruel, "How long?" He didn't answer. He didn't even meet her eyes. That silence was his answer. That silence did more damage than anything I could have shouted. Zach, bless him, still convinced he could salvage the night, took a few fumbling steps toward Brittany, who was now sitting with her arms crossed, looking like someone who had just learned her fiancé came from a family of con artists. "Britt, just wait, okay?" he stammered, and she turned to him with a look I'll never forget, not because it was angry or dramatic, but because it was so full of quiet, measured disappointment that it made everything else in the room feel cheap by comparison. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, and that single question knocked the wind out of him more than a scream ever could. He didn't answer. Another silence. Another truth. Linda didn't stay long. She looked around the room, realized what I had done, what she had walked into, and her face twisted not with guilt, but with the bitter shock of someone who thought they were the exception, not the symptom. She didn't say anything to me. She didn't need to. She turned and walked out as quickly as she had entered, and the door shut behind her with a kind of finality I hadn't anticipated. She hadn't come to fight, and I didn't blame her. In her mind, she had been promised something, maybe not explicitly, maybe not legally before that certificate, but promised all the same, and now she'd seen, in full color, what kind of man she had married. She looked embarrassed, but not surprised. Eventually, the room emptied. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in that quiet, awkward trickle that happens when people feel like they've been caught somewhere they shouldn't be, as though the guilt might attach itself to them if they linger too long. The string quartet started packing up their instruments, The caterers exchanged glances and began collecting half-finished plates, and someone dimmed the lights just slightly, as if that could soften what had already happened. I stood there longer than anyone, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know where else to go. I had dropped the truth like a bomb, and now I was standing in the ash, trying to figure out whether I had freed something or just set it all on fire. In the days that followed, the reactions came in waves. My mother packed a small bag and left the house, not with fury, not with sobbing goodbyes, but with a chilling, businesslike calm that told me she'd known more than she ever let on. Maybe she hadn't known the full extent of it, maybe she hadn't known about Linda or the Vegas certificate, but she had known enough to stop looking too closely, enough to keep her dignity intact by not asking questions with answers she couldn't live with. When I called her 2 days later to check in, she thanked me, not dramatically, not emotionally, just a quiet, "Thank you, Megan," for showing me what I needed to see. And then she hung up. Zach didn't call. He didn't text. I think part of him blames me, not because I lied or created this mess, but because I forced it to the surface, because I shattered the fantasy he had spent so much time curating, where our father was a respectable man, where our family was strong, where he could believe in the same ideas our father had spoon-fed us about honor and responsibility. He had built his life around that mythology, and I had ripped it out from under him at his own engagement party. I don't know if he'll forgive me. I don't know if he should. Brittany sent me a message, a short one, just a few days later. "I'm not sure if what you did was kind, but I think it was brave." Thank you. That meant more than I expected. She left Zach. Not immediately, but within the week. Apparently, she told him that if he could stand there and listen to a lie and still stay silent, he wasn't the man she thought he was. I respected her for that. More than anything, I respected her for walking away when most people would have clung tighter, hoping to fix something that was already broken long before she got there. And my father? He didn't reach out. Not once. No apology. No angry voicemail. No passive-aggressive email cloaked in faux concern. Nothing. Just silence. But somehow, that silence said more than any confrontation could have. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't destroyed. He was simply recalculating, adjusting the script, planning the next performance for an audience more willing to believe him. That's who he is. That's who he's always been. As for me, I don't regret what I did, not for a second. But I also don't feel triumphant. There was no applause, no victory lap, no closing credits with a satisfying moral. There was just the truth, laid bare and undeniable, and the messy, human consequences that come with it. I didn't expose my father because I wanted revenge, though maybe that's what started it. I did it because I couldn't carry his lies anymore. I was tired of pretending. I was tired of watching my mother pretend. I was tired of hearing the word commitment used like a weapon, like it only meant endurance and never meant honesty. Sometimes, I think about the look on my father's face that night, not the shock, but the moment after it, when he realized the performance was over, at least for that room. And in that look, I didn't see guilt. I saw contempt. He wasn't sorry. He was offended. Not because he'd been caught, but because someone had dared to ruin his carefully staged moment. That, more than anything, told me I'd done the right thing. Because if the truth ruins a person's celebration, maybe the celebration never belonged to the truth in the first place. And yet, despite all of it, despite the wreckage and the silences and the distance that will probably never close again, I still ask myself the question I didn't expect to linger. If I had stayed silent, would we all still be pretending we were happy? And which one of those versions of my family, the broken one or the pretend one, was more real?